and welcome to Catalyze Music Academy. My name is Zaak Kerstetter. I'm an Ableton Certified Trainer. And one of the questions I get a lot is, what is my favorite synthesizer in Live? And generally the answer to that question is going to be either Wavetable or Operator. They're great synths, they do everything, they're easy to use, they're fun to use, just fantastic synths all around, all-time favorites forever. However, there is I want to say it's a hidden gem, but there is a synth that I end up using quite a bit that I think flies under the radar and I think deserves a little bit of love. So I want to talk a little bit about Collision and just everything you need to know when it comes to working with Collision, because it is a fantastic synth that makes a huge variety of sounds and can be really, really fun to use. So that's what we're going to dive into today. Before we get into it, I do want to let you know, if you are enjoying the content on the channel, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. You can check out the Patreon, check out the Discord, all that stuff is linked below, all the YouTube things. It is all greatly appreciated. Collision itself is a physical modeling device, which means it's going to be using a different style of synthesis than a lot of your other synths you're going to encounter these days. It's not going to be doing subtractive synth or wavetable or FM or anything like that. It's kind of designed to act and sound like a real world instrument. That's what physical modeling does. So you're not going to see the same kind of like oscillators and filters and envelopes. You'll see some of that stuff, but it's going to behave a bit differently than how you're used to it. And then once you get used to it, it's really easy to use. So if we take a look here, Collision is kind of divided up into two different parts. We have this left side over here. This is going to be what's called our excitator, I believe is what it's called. This is going to be our imaginary object we're hitting with, right? So this is what we're going to be hitting with. And then this section over here that's kind of in the middle / right is going to be our resonator. This is going to be our objects that we're hitting. And so we have two excitators. We have the mallet here and the noise. And we have two resonators, resonator 1 and resonator 2. If you were to turn off both of the excitators, it doesn't do anything. If I play some notes, because we don't have any imaginary object to hit with. So at least one of these two needs to be turned on. So if I turn the mallet on, it now makes a sound. We can turn both on if we want. And we can use both, or just one. We can turn that up and get both. And then same thing's true with the resonators. We can use one resonator. If we turn both resonators off, it doesn't make any sound because we have no imaginary object to hit. All right, so we need at least one over here and at least one over here. And of course, we can turn both of these on together if we want, and we can mix and match between all four of them, depending on what we're going for. So that's the basic concept. That's how we're going to be starting to make our sounds, is we need at least one of both. Over here in the mallet, this is generally where I like to get started. This is going to be, like I said, our object we're hitting with, and this is designed to sound like a mallet. So you're going to be hitting things with a stick of some kind. And there's four pretty basic controls that are all really useful, things like volume. Keep in mind that the volume of the mallet is very important, because if I turn the volume down, the volume of the resonator goes with it, right? So because we have less volume triggering the resonator is going to be quiet. So this ends up being a very important control for just controlling how loud the entire thing is. We then have a stiffness control right here to control the stiffness of our mallet. So as I turn this down, we're going to get more of like a softer, almost kind of like a scraping kind of sound. Or way down, it's like no longer hitting, we're kind of scraping. And as I turn this up, it's going to sound more like a kind of refined metal on metal kind of sound. Like that. And so in the middle, you kind of get this kind of like softer, more kind of like padded mallet kind of sound. Then right here we have a noise control. This is going to basically adding in extra little harmonics, extra little frequency on top of what's going on here. So this is the volume of our noise. So as I turn this up, you're going to hear those higher frequencies get louder. Get louder there. If I want a bit more of like a more kind of muted, subtle kind of sound, if I turn this down, we don't get quite as much of those like metallic high frequencies in there. And of course, we can mix and match between these two to get, again, a much more kind of like softer kind of mallet control versus a harder one. Sounds totally different than when the noise is turned up. And then the color control is going to control the frequency of the noise. So if I turn the noise up a bit and I turn this up a bit, you're going to hear it's going to be a higher frequency. If we turn up way high, it gets too high, we can't hear it anymore. If we turn this down. If the noise is turned down, this doesn't do anything. So this only controls the color or frequency of the noise. It doesn't control the color of anything else here. So between all these, we can mix and match to get already a pretty wide range of sounds. On top of that, I would like to point out that all of these parameters, basically in the entire synth, can be velocity mapped and keyboard mapped. And you're going to do that over here in the MIDI page. So we can see we have mallet volume, mallet stiffness, and mallet noise. So if I want them to control by the MIDI note, I could keyboard map them. Or if I want them to be velocity mapped, I can do that right here. So for example, the mallet volume controls the volume of the entire thing, right? So this is a really kind of like useful parameter to be velocity mapped. That way, if I hit this really soft, it's gonna be quiet. If I hit harder, it's gonna be louder, right? So that's probably where I'd add my velocity mapping for volume. It's gonna be right here on the mallet volume itself. So we'll come back to this in a little bit. So that's our mallet. Really straightforward, really easy to use. I really like it. It sounds really good, and it's pretty hard to make it sound bad, which is fantastic. Over here, we're going to have our noise oscillator. So it's going to use a white noise generator to trigger our resonator. This one I think can sound really cool, but it tends to take a little bit more work, a little bit more effort to make it sound really dialed in. And we have a few really important controls. So number one, we have the volume. It starts off really quiet. So if I crank this up here, obviously it's going to be louder. And then we have a ADSR control. So this is going to be our basic volume control. So we have attack, decay, sustain, and release here. So if I turn up the decay, again, we get more of that kind of like scraping sound if I hold this note down. Or I can turn up some attack. So just controlling the volume of our white noise. On top of that, we have a filter right here. This defaults as a low pass filter, although we can change between low pass, high pass, band pass, or both low pass and high pass. I tend to think the low pass works the best, but try them out for yourself, see what you think. So we have the filter frequency. So if I turn this up, once again, kind of like with the noise and the color, we're gonna get more of those higher frequencies, more of that kind of metallic ringing kind of sound, or make it more subtle, depending on how I have the setup. And then we have a resonance right here for our filter. So a bit we can play around with there. On top of that, we have this envelope amount control right here. This is a little bit confusing because this envelope amount doesn't control the volume envelope. Well, kind of it does. It's going to take the volume envelope, which will always apply to the volume, and it's going to also apply this volume envelope to our filter frequency. If I have my filter frequency turned down like this, and if I give it a little bit of decay, and I turn this up, the volume envelope also now applies to the filter frequency and makes it move up. Or if you go into negative values, it makes it move down. So this is what the envelope does. It takes our volume envelope that always applies the volume and also applies it to filter frequency. So that's kind of it. That's all you really need to know about the noise. Like I said, if I had to choose one, I tend to choose mallet because it sounds better usually and it's easier to use. Although sometimes I'll use both, in which case it'll sound like you're hitting your imaginary object with two mallets at the same time, which can be really cool to add some like cool little bit of extra texture in there. So those are our excitators, whatever they're called. And then over here, we have our resonator. So resonator 1 and resonator 2 are exactly the same. You can turn them on and off independently. They can have totally different settings from each other. It's up to you how you want to set them up. We're going to start with resonator 1, and then we'll move over to resonator 2 once we figure this out. So the resonator is where you're going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to your sound design in Collision. So the first thing you want to check out is there are 7 different resonator types: beam, marimba, string, membrane, plate, pipe, and tube. They all sound fairly different from each other. They all have different settings, and they're going to get you very different results. So far, we've been listening to the beam. Has this very kind of like xylophone kind of sound to it, which is really nice. The marimba is going to be fairly similar. You can hear the harmonics are a little different, but they're fairly similar to each other. The string sounds like a very kind of like hammer, dulcimer, kind of harpsichord kind of sound, which is really nice. The membrane is going to sound like you're hitting a metal plate. One thing I think is really important to point out is that a lot of these different resonators will sound very different at lower frequencies than they will at higher frequencies. So it's important to try it out at a high frequency and a low frequency and see if you can find like a sweet spot where it sounds really good. We have the plate, which is going to be very similar to the membrane. Also sounds like you're hitting a metal plate. And then we have the pipe, which is going to sound like hitting a pipe. And we have the tube, which is going to be kind of similar to that, but different kind of opening. So between the 7, beam and marimba are fairly similar to each other. Membrane and plate are fairly similar to each other, and pipe and tube are fairly similar to each other. And then strings kind of on its own. A lot of diversity and a lot of different types of sounds that we can just recreate just by switching between these. So let's start with the beam and we'll play around with it a little bit. One thing I also want to point out is that these 5 controls down here, the control here, 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 and here, might change a little bit depending on which resonator you're using. So if I switch to, for example, the pipe, these controls are a little different, these controls are a little different, so it varies a little bit depending on what you're using. So watch out for that. We'll talk about that more as we go through it. Before we dive into those controls though, there is a quality control right here, and I think this is really interesting. So there are 4 quality controls. We have high, medium, low, and eco. Generally, for the most part, the difference between high, medium, and low is very, very subtle, to the point where it's almost impossible to tell the difference between this is being high, this being medium, that being low. You hear a little bit on low. Eco, however, you can definitely hear a difference. And we can even test this out by checking it out with our spectrum analyzer. So if we check this out on high, and I'm playing, this C note right here, we get all of these different harmonics. But when I switch this down to eco, we only get about 4 harmonics here. And this is true for a lot of these guys. We get the string on eco, we only get a couple of these spikes right here, versus high, we get all these over here, versus low, we get some here. So what we're doing here is essentially getting less harmonics as the quality goes down, which I think is actually really interesting because a lot of the times when you're working with collision, especially if you have like, things like the noise and the color turned up really high, you get these really super bright, metallic, almost kind of like piercing sounds, like a lot of those frequencies up there. Sometimes you might want to tone those down, and one way to do that would be to switch your settings down to be a lower setting so you don't get quite as many of those high frequencies. So you can use them almost kind of like a filter, where you're kind of like, as you go lower on the settings, you're getting less higher frequencies. So with each one of these, we're going to have 2 controls down here. For the most part, with 2 exceptions, we're going to get decay time going left to right, and then material going up and down. So decay time is obviously going to be how long it's going to resonate out for. So if I want to make a really short kind of sound, we can make this really short and choppy. If I want to make this resonate for a long time, we can make it run for a long time if we want. And then as you go up and down, we can control the material. And this will be different depending on which resonator you're using. But you get a lot of different sounds depending on how you set this up. Like, as I mentioned, it'll be different for each one. And we can, of course, use the XY controller together to find the sweet spot where we like it the best. If we go down to, for example, the pipe and the tube, this will still be decay time here. And then we have a radius control here, which if you set it high, you get these nice kind of like string controls. And again, this is one of the reasons I really like collision, is you get lots of different kind of cool little hidden options depending on how you have your settings set up. And then tube is also going to be radius control and decay control. Underneath these 2 controls, we're going to get 3 controls down here. Generally, they're going to be brightness, inharmonics, and ratio, but once again, they will change a little bit depending on which resonator you're using. The brightness, you can kind of think like a filter. As you turn this up, it's going to emphasize more higher frequencies and de-emphasize the lower frequencies. And as you turn it down, it's going to emphasize more lower frequencies and de-emphasize the higher frequencies. So let me turn do something like that. It's not too ringy. Turn the color down a little bit. If I turn the brightness, you can hear more emphasis on these frequencies here. You turn this down, less emphasis on those high frequencies, more emphasis on those low frequencies. So once again, up to you, wherever you want to put it. It's a nice way to kind of control your frequencies a little bit. Then we have an inner harmonics controller here. This one's really fascinating, and I want to talk about this for a moment. The way this works is that if I were to play this C note right here, for example, this right here is your fundamental. This is the actual note that I'm playing, right? All of these other spikes in volume are our harmonics. I made a video talking about harmonics in sound design a while back. I will put that up in the corner. Check that out if this doesn't make any sense. But essentially, all of these spikes in volume determine what my sound sounds like. The in-harmonics control will allow me to detune all of these frequencies up here, but not the actual note that I'm playing. So this spike in volume will stay where it is. All of the rest of them will move up and down. And we can try this out to give it a little bit more decay. And if I change this, you can see this spike right here is staying exactly where it is, and all the rest of them are moving up or down. And at really extreme settings, you can do some like pretty wild stuff with it. Like in this case, we made the beam sound a lot like the plate setting, for example. A lot of fun stuff you can do with it. It's just basically going to detune your harmonics while keeping your fundamental the same. At really small amounts, it makes it sound like a little bit kind of out of tune, but not enough to like makes it sound like actually out of tune. So it's a great way to add like a bit more kind of like realness or organicness to your sound. It's like detuning it a little bit with the inharmonics, which is great. And then we have ratio, which doesn't work on this setting. So these controls here are going to be basically the same for the beam, the marimba, and the string. Nothing changes there. And then when we switch to the membrane, the only thing that changes is we now get a ratio control. So this turns on. So the ratio is going to control the length versus the width of our metal object that we're hitting, which will then affect the harmonics and affect kind of like the tonal quality of our sound. So if I turn this up, it makes it sound kind of different. I'll turn the noise down a little bit. That's kind of cool. A lot of fun stuff you can do with that. And of course, you can combine that with brightness and inharmonics to make lots of different sounds. Same thing is true for the plate, works the same way. Depending on where you set that. Then when we switch over to the pipe and the tube, as we already talked about, we get decay here and we get radius here. Brightness doesn't do anything, ratio doesn't do anything, and then we get an opening control. So it's going to change the width of our opening of our pipe. Let's say if you turn it low, you get more kind of metallic sounds. Like that. And then on the tube, none of them work. This doesn't do anything, this doesn't do anything, this doesn't do anything. So a lot of the controls will change as you switch it up, but it's all kind of the same basic concept there. So those are our 5 main controls for our resonators. On top of that, we're going to get a few more over here. The first one I'll talk about is going to be the hit control. And this one I think is really interesting. The hit control essentially changes where you're going to hit your imaginary object with your imaginary mallet. And the way this works is that 0% is going to be closer to the center of the object, and 100% is going to be closer to the edge of the object. So at 0%, sounds like this, and then as I move this around, you can see it like kind of subtly changes what we're hearing here. And if we have more kind of extreme settings, we have like a, let's try a different one. Let's try this, for example. It's never going to like make or break your sound, but it's like a cool, interesting, subtle control you have access to. And then of course we can randomize our hit control. So depending on where you want to put it. You can randomize it so it hits it in different places a little bit each time. The hit percentage is going to be relative specifically to the positioning L and the positioning R. So the positioning L and positioning R are basically going to be the positioning of our imaginary microphones in relationship to our imaginary object. So hopefully that makes sense. We have our imaginary mallet, we have an imaginary object, and we have two imaginary microphones, one for the left side, one for the right side. So part of the reason that this changes our sound in that kind of subtle way from in the stereo field is that the position of our microphone on the left is closer to the center of the object, and the positioning of the microphone on the right is closer to the edge of the object. We, of course, can change these to be wherever we want, and once again, it will subtly affect our sound depending on where we go in relationship to our hit percentage. So kind of a cool, subtle set of features there to create a little bit more kind of like stereo texture with our sound. The last control over here is going to be the note off control. Think of this kind of like a choke for the decay of our sound. At 0%, it doesn't matter how long or how short or how long I hit that note, it's always going to play the full decay, right? So if I barely touch a note, it plays the whole thing. If I turn this to 100%, it's only going to play the note for as long as I'm holding down the MIDI note. So if I hold down a MIDI note, it plays the whole thing. As soon as I let go, it stops. And if I just barely touch it, it only plays for as long as I'm playing. So generally it defaults to being at 0%, so it'll play the whole thing, regardless of how long I play it. If you put it somewhere in the middle, it'll still only play it as long as I play it, but it'll kind of decay out. So you can kind of control the decay or the release based off of how long you play the notes by turning this up or not. Then we have a tuning control in semitones, pretty straightforward, pitch up and down, tuning in cents. And we have a pitch envelope. And this is actually really cool. This will basically change our pitch over time. If you turn this up, it's going to start your pitch high and then turn it down to the note that you're playing based off of the amount of time set right here. So now if I play this, we get these little laser sounds. And if I change the timing here, it'll take 1 second to get to note I'm playing. And one of the reasons I like this is that the cool thing about physical modeling devices is that they can not only recreate real world sounds, but you can use them to make laser noises or other weird sound effects or things you couldn't do with, for example, a marimba. If I turn this up, it's going to start high and go low. If I turn this down, it's going to start low and go high. And you can make it really subtle if you want to. Or you can make it really obvious and do really fun stuff with it. But pretty straightforward. Changes your pitch over time. This is the amount, as well as the direction, and this is how long it takes. That's basically it. And then we have panning control on a per oscillator basis. It's going to pan it left and right. We got a volume control. It's going to control the volume of just this resonator, which is different than the volume of this resonator. And then lastly, we have the bleed percentage. I'm going to be real honest with you about the bleed percentage. This is one of the only knobs in the entire software of Ableton Live that I still don't understand what it does. I've read the manual, I've talked to people, I've asked questions, nobody knows. The way the manual describes it is it says that it mixes unprocessed signal with processed signal, but it doesn't define what processed signal or unprocessed signal are. So if you know what bleed percentage does, let me know. I have not figured it out yet. And for the most part, it doesn't really do anything. If I play a note, sounds basically exactly the same to me. I think if you set it to like the membrane settings, you can hear it a little better. If you turn it up, you can hear a little bit of a knocking. So it sounds like it's mixing in like a little bit of the mallet by itself as its own sound. I'm not really entirely sure. If you know, let me know. But I've never really concerned myself too much with it because it mostly doesn't do a whole lot. So yeah, those are all of our resonator settings. Resonator 2 has all of the exact same settings, but they can be totally different. So this could be tuned differently, get different brightness settings, different resonator type. You can mix and match between them, whatever you want, which is really great. However, one of the things I do want to mention before we talk about Resonator 2 is our structure controls. So you may notice that if you have Resonator 1 turned on, and then you turn on Resonator 2, and you play a note, it's going to sound terrible, and I apologize in advance for this. Not good. Sounds like microphone feedback. It's not what I want. Don't want that to be there at all. And the reason this happens is that the structure here is 1 going into 2, which means we have the mallet, which is triggering resonator 1, and then the volume of resonator 1 is triggering the volume of resonator 2, which creates these very kind of feedbacky, resonant sounds that are not good. So generally what I recommend doing, unless you have very short decay times on both resonator 1 and resonator 2, is you switch your structure over to 1 and 2. What this means is that you're going to have your mallet that's going to be simultaneously hitting 2 resonators parallel from one another, which instead of sounding like this, unfortunately I'm going to do this to you one more time just so you can experience it again. Instead of sounding like that, it's going to sound like this. Infinitely more palatable, way easier to work with, way easier to use. I highly recommend if you're going to be using more than one resonator, switch to this mode first and make your life way easier. So once we've done that, I can now, like I said, have resonator 1 have its own set of settings. I could be using string, a little bit of brightness, a little bit of inner harmonics. This one's set to beam, make the different decay here, pitch this one up an octave, do whatever I need to do to make it sound cool. And all of a sudden I get some like cool, interesting sounds that are really easy to work with. The only other kind of interesting thing in terms of relationship between resonator 1 and resonator 2 is you have this 1 to 2 button or 2 to 1 button. This is just going to copy all of your settings on resonator 1 to resonator 2, or all the settings on resonator 2 to resonator 1. So that's it. Pretty straightforward. Mix and match as you want. And then, of course, you could have both of your excitators turned on, triggering both your resonators all at the same time. And then over here, we're going to have an LFO page. So we do get a little bit of kind of like classic synthesizer modulation controls in the form of 2 LFOs. You're going to get all the basic LFO controls you've seen before in other instruments. So we have LFO rate, we have LFO amount. We can either sync the rate or have it unsynced. We can have the shape be whatever shape we want. And then we can map these two up to 2 different destinations per LFO. So destination 1 can be any one of these guys. You are somewhat limited in terms of your destinations. There's only so many parameters in Collision to modulate, but you have some like cool access to things. So say, for example, you wanted to add like a little bit of vibrato to your resonator. You could map it to resonator 1 pitch. And so now if I play this, it's not going to sound like vibrato yet, but it is moving this up and down. So if I speed this up, let me change the pitch here and turn the amount down. So you can get like a little bit of vibrato in there, depending on how you want your settings to be, or map this to, again, any one of these parameters you want. Which once again is really great for creating sounds that you couldn't make with a real world sound, because you can do weird things to change pitch, change all this kind of stuff. And then lastly, we have a MIDI page over here that once again has options for us controlling the key as well as the velocity, or keyboard tracking as well as velocity on any of these parameters. Pretty nice. And then we also can control basically anything we want with either our pitch bend, our modulation wheel, and our aftertouch. These are all the same parameters we saw in the LFOs. And then lastly, we have a global section here. So we have number of voices, monophonic up to 16 voices, structure we already talked about, and then global volume. That's it. Those are our controls inside of Collision. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, a little confusing until you get used to it. And then once you get used to it, it's pretty straightforward and it's pretty easy to make things that sound really cool. Making really pretty bell sounds is really easy to do. You can make some cool string sounds. You can get really abstract with it. I made a video where I made a kick drum out of Collision a while ago. Go nuts with it. Have fun with it. It's really, really easy to use and it's really fun. I feel like I keep saying that all the time, but it's true. One of my favorite go-tos for using Collision is to toss on like an arpeggiator and then toss on a delay and then just kind of like play some notes and kind of see what happens. And it's really easy to make it work in a song. And I haven't really done anything to these settings yet. I didn't do anything there. I was just screwing around with the decay material on these 2 settings and just playing some notes. Fantastic tool. Try it out for yourself. Let me know how it goes in the comment section below, and have some fun with it. And hopefully I'll see you again in the next video. Thanks for watching.